So what were the lessons that we learned on this project? Okay, well, first off, identify the fundamental goal. What's our objective here? You know, this community wanted to create an additional access for boating and to get out into the water as a secondary access for security reasons. There was many people that stood up and spoke at the hearing that said, please give us a secondary access, because if you look at the geomorphology of the area, if you're coming up from the south, say from Burnt Storm Marina to the south, and you're headed north, and we get one of our winter cold fronts that come through very quickly, and you've got to go all the way around the western tip and then into Ponce de Leon Channel, the ability to duck into Alligator Creek and take the interior canal system home is a very valuable asset from a safety standpoint. It also gives emergency access, the ability to get to land sooner. So if we've got a boater that's hurt at the mouth of Alligator Creek and needs to be transported by emergency boat to land for emergency transport by an ambulance, having Alligator Creek access is a shorter distance than them having to go out into Charlotte Harbor and up the Punta Gorda Isles. So really identify what your fundamental goals are and what the objectives of your client are, and apply those engineering skills that you're gaining the best that you can. You know, use your common sense, stick to what the focus is, and don't get too sidetracked. Second item, listen carefully. Weed out the noise and focus on the fundamentals. As I explained before, that one crazy person that you think is crazy, you know, they may have things to say that would cause you to go, God, that guy is full of BS. I'm not listening to him at all. Listen to him. You might pick up one or two things that are useful, that can help you with your design, that can help you counter somebody else's comment that's off the wall. So keep that in mind. Listen carefully when you're in those environments. Listen carefully to what your client's saying. Focus. Listen carefully to what the regulatory agencies are saying, and then listen to the folks that are going to be impacted by the project. Safe navigation. You know, I put the design in there to make the 90-degree turns because I was focused on trying to minimize mangrove impacts. However, you know, I'm a licensed captain and I've been running boats all my life. Not everybody is capable of doing that. And so I had many people come up and say, Hans, you need to eliminate those 90-degree turns. Can you smooth this out? Can you round these corners? And I said, first, I said, well, that's going to be a challenge because the regulatory agencies are going to be fighting us on that. But it was incumbent upon me to try and find that balance, that benefit to cost relationship. And so I made the case to the agencies and I said, look, you know, not all these boaters are skilled. We don't want to have boating accidents. We can mitigate for these impacts. We're creating sawfish habitat in many cases that's beneficial. We're creating mangrove habitat here. While yes, there's additional impacts to mangroves, the benefit is to improve navigation. And that's really what was important. And then you could fall back on the things that you already put into the design. You know, the minimized resource impacts statement here under 4, you know, right from the get-go, I knew that we were going to have cantilevered walls, because with a cantilevered wall, you can have 6 feet of water depth and you can have your mangroves over here and allow for that tidal exchange. If I was to dig this as a regular channel and you went to a 3-to-1 slope where my 6-foot water depth was at -6 and a 3-to-1 slope, I've got to come back almost 18 feet of mangrove habitat to get to the top of my bank or the top of my slope. So, and I could say that back to the folks that were giving me grief about the mangrove impact and say, look, we've implemented a methodology here that's expensive. You know, those vertical walls and those earth anchors were expensive. They were much more expensive than just cutting a channel with a 3-to-1 slope. But that made the case for us having to impact those mangroves, and they were okay with that. Mitigate on site if you can. Usually it's hard to. In our particular situation, we did some restoration on site to sort of enhance the project. We didn't get much credit for it on the mitigation side. We still had to buy credits from Little Pine Island Mitigation Bank. but it resulted in a lot of goodwill towards the DEP in terms of our meeting the public interest test. Look at your long-term maintenance requirements. Don't look at your projects when you're done as, you know, I'm done and walk away. Go back and look at your projects on a regular basis and see how they're performing, because that's adding to your information library of your particular profession and what you do. And so don't be afraid to go back, and that ramp that you designed, you know, go launch your boat on it and see how it's functioning. Is it working? Should you have made the in-water portion steeper so the boat floats off the trailer quicker? Or is the in-water portion too steep so when you put your boat on the trailer, the water comes spilling in over the transom? Those little detail things that you need to be thinking about as you're creating your information library, and long-term maintenance is one of them. I think the settling basin was a really good solution. We didn't have any resource impact other than the mangroves. There was no seagrasses in this area, which was fortunate. But I think the settling basin buys a longer time frame for the city before they have to do any kind of maintenance. I don't know that for certain, though. We could get a major storm event that just nails this area and takes and washes out all of it and fills in all the channels. You can't plan for that. You can anticipate it may happen, but you have to be wise on how you choose your resources and how you apply them. Item number 7, get to know your contractors. Really learn to, you know, if you can, make friends with your contractors. When you get it at the end of the day, yeah, maybe you need to get back and get your timesheets entered, but if the guys that you're working with say, hey, let's go have a beer, or I got a great fishing hole I want to show you, do it. Get on their boat, or offer to take them fishing, or offer to buy them beer, or whatever it takes to establish those personal relationships. When I first started, I was under the impression that being an engineer, if I did a really good job, I would have no problems. And I've come to learn that over time, you still need to do a good job, but you also need to make sure that you maintain those relationships with your contractors, with your civil servants, you know, with your clients and the people that work for them, treating everybody with respect as much as you can, and even the boneheads. You know, if they do something, if a contractor does something silly in the field and get sideways from it, make light of it nicely and help them fix it. In this particular case, we encountered rock on site, so we had to work with them on getting that rock out of the area. And we had some issues with how we were going to test for the holding capacity of the helical anchors. The contractor was sort of skimming on that, and we said, no. We're going to have you make sure that you know how to fix this so it works right. And so we worked with them, and we did it in a cooperative nature. We're right now still dealing with the mitigation shelf issue. Again, we have evidence that we had gone in and certified the elevation. The contractor came back and modified it, and we're not having success with our mangrove installation on the one side. But we'll work through that, again, through mutual respect and focusing on doing the right thing. Work closely with your client. You know, we were gifted that the city of Punta Gorda has a very knowledgeable, very active staff that's water-oriented. You know, they're a water community. They really, truly are. It's one of their advertisements for their city. And so their staff were just so pleasant to work with. And so that's important. And if you can measure what that's going to be like before you get into a project, it's helpful. You know, it's very helpful if the client that you're working with has knowledge of the water environment, or if you're a civil engineer and you're doing apartment housing, working with a client that's done 100 apartment developments before is a much easier client to work with than someone who's just starting out new. If they are just starting out new and they're bound and determined to do that project and they want to hire you, then you need to be prepared to educate them on the 100 apartment development projects that you've done, and educate them and teach them so that they're making good decisions. Don't be afraid to hold your contractor's feet to the fire on permit compliance. You know, that's hard because, as I mentioned before, when a contractor goes idle, that equipment's costing them money just sitting there. If that equipment's not being operated, it's not making money, it's costing them money. If they've got field people, a foreman, an office worker, or laborers out there standing around with nothing to do and their elbow halfway up their arm, that's costing them money as well, because they're still getting paid, but they're not producing anything. So when you have a problem, you've got to look out for your client's interests. You've got to shut down the contractor and make sure that you don't have any compliance issues, but you also got to work with that contractor to resolve those compliance issues. And trust me, it never works to try and look the other way. I recall a dredging project where we were filling, it was a hydraulic project which moved a lot of water, and we had created a big basin. We had dug out and created these berms around this basin, and the contractor was filling it, and he wasn't paying attention to his discharge site, and the discharge site breached the berm, totally blew out the berm, flooded the adjacent mangroves with a bunch of sand and silt, and it was a mess. And the first thing that I did is I got on the phone to the DEP, and I said, John, here's what's happened. Here's why it's happened. It was an accident. Here's what we're doing about it. We will have this cleaned up for you in less than a week. I will photo document it, and I will verify for you that we've cleaned it up and restored it to its original condition. And I did just exactly that, and we never had a consent order or violation issued by the DEP because we were proactive in fixing the problem. So that's really important, is being proactive and being honest with your regulatory agencies and with your client and with your contractors. You know, work with your contractors and make them operate at the same standard. So there you go. There's a nice photograph from the drone of Charlotte Harbor in the background. That's Alligator Creek in the foreground. And what was once called Bird Cut is now referred to as Buckley's Pass. And it was one of the coolest things I got a chance to do was that when the City Council of Punta Gorda finally agreed that we were going to move forward with the project and we weren't turning back, I had about 2 seconds before I had to leave the podium for somebody else to start speaking. And I said, Council, could I ask a favor? And that kind of took them aback. And I said, the person who was behind making this happen, his name was Jay Buckley, and he didn't live to see this project come to fruition. But I said you would do him a great honor if you could name this pass after him. So they did. So it's now called Buckley's Pass. There you go. Questions?
Thank you. If you have any question, you can speak.
I know that you mentioned early on that whenever you get the permit or are in the process of getting the permit, you start working on the project. Has there ever been a case where you were in the process of getting the permit, but right before getting it, it was suddenly revoked?
Well, you're either getting a permit or not. Now we don't do construction on a project until we're fully permitted. Now, I've had situations where I've had a permit issued and I've had to then go to construction, and the neighbor was not aware that the work was going to take place, and they petitioned for administrative hearing, and then they filed an injunction and stopped the contractor in his tracks. So the way that we deal with that is that when we have our state permit issued, we notice it in the local paper. We're right up front. Here's what we're going to do. Here's the notice. And if nobody petitions for administrative hearing in a 21-day time frame, because it has to go into a paper of local circulation, at the end of that 21 days, that Chapter 120 window closes. And so you won't have that permit go into hiatus or even get revoked. I've never had a permit revoked ever. I've had permits that we had non-compliance issues with where we had to enter into a consent order to resolve the non-compliance, but I've never had a permit revoked.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. You mentioned at the beginning that you select you have a very specific way of selecting your clients. And you mentioned that there were some clients that you didn't want to work with, that you had a way to get rid of them in a way. Can you give me an example of that? Because in my job, I deal with that often. You know, customers that have an idea in their head that it's really not viable, and I'd rather not work with them.
It's difficult to do because you're rejecting somebody, and that's always difficult for any of us. We never like to be rejected. But I can give you a classic example. This occurred 2 weeks ago. I had an association that approached me about doing a seawall inspection. At the same time, there was a lake bank restoration being done that was tied directly to the condition of the seawall. The association board member that contacted me wanted me to work on the seawall, do the inspection on the seawall because they had some undermining issues. However, I knew who the contractor was working on the lake bank restoration, and it's a contractor that we don't recommend for a couple of reasons. But at that same time, I was told that another board member was working with that contractor. And so I put together a proposal and I sent it out. And then I immediately got contacted by the attorney for the association that wanted me to send them our Word document of our contract and all of our general conditions, and they were going to rewrite it. Well, first off, the first red flag was that they're working with what I consider to be a disreputable contractor who was giving them a line of BS about their permitting requirements. Second red flag was that I've got one board member working on one project and another board member working on a separate project. They're interrelated, but they're not communicating with each other. Third red flag was that I've got an attorney from the East Coast wanting to totally rewrite my contract, and that doesn't happen. Very seldom does that ever happen. I might get a tweak or two in terms of the timing on the tasks, but I've never had an attorney ask to rewrite my general conditions because they're pretty standard, they're pretty uniform, and pretty much industry standard. That was the third red flag. And then the fourth red flag was that the next day I got the signed contract from the board president. And what I'm seeing there is I got a board president that's going against the wishes of their attorney. That's too many red flags. That is going to be a problem dealing internally with that association. And fortunately, from the time I sent the proposal out to the time that I actually got the signed proposal, I was contracted to be an expert witness on a pretty large project down in the Keys, which was just going to suck up all my time, and I had absolutely no time to work on that seawall project. So I just politely said to them, I said, I'm sorry, in the interim, I can't service this proposal. I gave them recommendations for 2 other competitive engineers that they can go to that can do the same work, and just graciously, as much as I could, bowed out of the project because there was too many red flags. Now, sometimes you can't see that. You get a contract, you get a client that comes in and he looks good on paper. You know, he's done other projects before. He's worked with other contractors. He seems like a really nice guy. But then you start working with him, and then things start happening like you don't get payment for 90 days. Or you send them an email with verification that they received the email with something that's important, and then they call you 3 days later and say, hey, I thought you were going to send me this, and you know that they've already opened up the email, and they say that they haven't. So when they start playing tricks with you all like that, that's when you reassess whether you want to continue to work with them as a client. So, but it's not easy. It's really comes with a matter of experience. And even then, sometimes we still get hung up with a client that's just not that great. And so the best you can do is work your way through it, learn from the experience, add it to your personal library of information about how you choose the next client.
Thank you so much.
Now, if you guys want if you want short answers to questions, ask me a short question. But I like to tell the long stories, so I apologize if I'm long-winded on that.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ray. Any other questions? On the peak, we have like 60 participants, 60 students. Now it's about 55. 2 questions so far.
Hey, that's not bad. We only lost 5 out of the 60.
Yeah. So the peak is 61, and it dropped 2. 2, 3.
Okay.
Can you stop looking?
So I am available, though, if you go through Dr. Long, if you have any other questions, or you can email me those questions. My email is really simple. It's a good engineering norm to keep your things simple, and it's simply hans@hanswilson.com.
So we have a question on the chat.
Sure.
From Jetty. Jetty, can you stop working for someone after you start the work?
Yes, if you have provisions in your contract that say that, you know, we have the right to terminate this contract with 30 days notice, you can. I terminated a really big contract with a local government here because the chairman of that organization was being really problematic to work with, and for what we were deriving out of it in terms of income compared to how many hours we were putting into it, we were in the negative, and it just wasn't worth it. It was a great contract in the beginning, but the new chairman just made it so difficult to work with. It was like being with the bad board or a homeowners association board. You just had this one guy that was, you know, I won't go into details, but we gave them 30 days notice according to our contract, and we said we can no longer provide services to you. And it really doesn't matter why. If you write your contract with that provision, you have that right. As most cases, the client does too. And that's hurtful as well, because again, it's a rejection thing. You're in a contract with a client, and all of a sudden they send you a letter that says, we're terminating your services. You have 30 days notice. Now, I can't remember that happening. I have one project fairly recently where that did occur, and it was actually sort of a godsend because the client was a C client, and what was really problematic for us is that they were not a very good communicator at all. They didn't keep us in the loop on what they were doing. We were trying to move as fast as they asked, but they weren't communicating the information to us. So they found somebody else that I think was brought in through other connections. You know, you can't win them all. So again, you'll learn from that. Add that to your personal library of experience. Remember who that client was. And we've done a number of projects with them. And remember who's in the background pulling their strings. And that's really important to know as well.
So that's the follow-up question that Chetty have. And if you have any other question, I think there may be another last question so that I don't want to hold hands any further. The next question is, have you ever had to take over a project that was already started by another firm?
I have. In fact, that's where your skills as a politician, which being an engineer, you're going to find in time that you're also going to have to be part politician, came into play. I had a client that came to me. He wasn't a client then. He was in the process of doing a multifamily dock project. And he was working with a civil engineer that shouldn't have been working on the dock project, because everybody thinks docks are easy, but the permitting on sovereign state lands and other locations is always a pain in the rear. And unless you really know the rules, you can get really sideways and it gets expensive. And this engineer had this client into having to get a submerged land lease. There was mitigation. They had to do public interest. It was just a big CF. And so he came to me and says, I want you to take this project over. I'm going to fire this guy. And I said, whoa, 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 wait a second. Look, here's what we're going to do. You pay me for my time. I will work with the civil engineer, and I will help that civil engineer redesign that dock so it meets all the rules and the regulations so that you're not being drug out time frame wise and on a lease. So we were able to put together a dock plan that got him out of getting a lease. He can now qualify for consent to use. It changed the whole dynamic on the permitting. So the permitting came out in a much shorter period of time. That engineer was able to save face with his client, and I got paid for my time to help that engineer basically save his butt. So that's the way I prefer to do that, because everybody comes out better for it. But I know other firms that go like, we'll take that project over from Wilson, no problem, you know. But that's just not the way I operate. And that's one of the things you have to also understand in the world. Engineering firms, they're all different, they're managed different, they're operated differently. The people in charge of those firms have different ways of doing things. So I just prefer to try to take the high road if I can, and mitigate any potential personal damage to anybody. Again, nobody likes rejection. Help the other guy, try and get him out of a jam. And he was very grateful to me for being willing to do that instead of just taking the project away from him. So it was good. It was good mojo all across the board for everybody involved.
Thank you. So, any one final questions before we convene?
Yeah, I guess I have one quick question. So regarding like when you're required by the state to provide mitigation for a site, do they like recommend certain techniques, or do you have more liberty on that type of mitigation?
Well, the mitigation that we deal with, here's the problem with mitigation these days. It used to be that you could design your mitigation plan for your impacts, and you could do it on site. That was always preferred. And even today, the DEP and the district water management district will let you do that. The problem is the Army Corps of Engineers doesn't allow you to do that unless you go through the process of establishing your own mitigation bank. In other words, there's almost this 12-step process that you have to go through to guarantee that your mitigation site is going to be successful. You have to bond it, you have to monitor it, you have to provide monitoring reports, the whole litany of things as if you had done your own mitigation bank. And so what it turns out to be is cheaper in the long run to just buy your mitigation credits from a local mitigation bank. And in this particular case, it's Little Pine Island Mitigation Bank. And so that makes things cleaner and a little bit easier. It's the reason why the Corps prefers that is that they don't have to go out and monitor these mitigation sites. They know it's being done properly by Little Pine Island Mitigation Bank because they're certified as a mitigation bank. They're a big deal. So that's the reason why. Now, where you have some flexibility is on how much mitigation you have to provide, and that circles back to your assessment of the functions of the site. When you impact mangroves, you have to make what's called the uniform mitigation and assessment methodology. You have to employ that to determine what the loss of functions are. And are those functions, is it pristine habitat, or did you have boats going by here? Is there no residential development for 5 miles around, or do I have homes on each side? So it's that assessment of the functions and the final determination of what mitigation is required is about the only latitude that you've got today in terms of mitigation work.
So one final question on the chat, and that from Jamie. Do you want to read to Mr. Wilson, or I read your question, Jamie? Okay, Could homeowners?
I can read it to him.
Okay, thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, could homeowners tow their boats to the Ponce outlet, or was towing considered?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Explain that better.
Yeah, could homeowners tow their boats to the outlet that already existed, or was it even considered?
Well, when you say towing, you're talking about boats on trailers?
Yes.
But there is a boat ramp there. So people could tow their boats to Ponce Inlet and launch their boats there. This channel was designed predominantly for people that had their boats in water slips. And if you take a look at that community, even if you jump on the Charlotte County Property Appraiser's website and you look at that community, you're going to see there's a huge amount of boats that are in the water full time in this canal system. And in fact, this is probably one of the most active boating and sailboat racing communities that I'm aware of in the state of Florida.